And joining us now on the debate for the full hour, in Las Vegas, Nevada, Reiner Spencer, founder and director of the Afro-American Studies program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And with us here in studio, Manel Matani, professor of geography and journalism at University of Toronto. Ravi Jain, an immigration lawyer with the Toronto firm Green and Spiegel. Jean Taye, partner in the law firm Pape, Salter, Taye, and the great-grandniece of Louis Riel. And Sarah Grzinczyk is completing a master's degree at the University of Toronto. Hello to you all.
Hello, thanks for having us.
So just before we get underway, I want to start by bringing up some statistics. This comes from the 2006 federal Canadian census. Take a look at these numbers. In 2006, 3.9%, or some 7.5 million Canadian couples, were in mixed unions. And if we compare that to 5 years earlier, back in 2001, the percentage of mixed unions was 3.1%. A decade before that, 2.6%. So that really means in a 5-year period between 2001 and 2006, mixed unions grew at a very rapid pace, 33%. And that figure is 5 times the growth for all couples. So clearly, people from different backgrounds are marrying and entering into unions. It's a growing trend, and you all are children of multiracial relationships. So I want to start by going around to all of you and ask you, from a purely biological position, what is your background? Reiner, why don't you start us off?
Oh, well, from a purely biological background, well, I'm a racial skeptic, first of all, so I hesitate to give my sort of racial pedigree. But for the sake of answering your question, my mother would be considered white, my father would be considered black.
Okay, thanks for doing that. Jean, go ahead. What's your background?
My mother is Polish and Scottish, and my father is French and Métis. So, and the Métis mix is basically Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, and French.
Okay.
So,
Ravi Jain, what's your background?
Interesting. Well, first of all, I want to share Reiner's perspective here because I am similarly a racial skeptic. I think there's more genetic difference between, like, amongst races than even between them. But I think, nevertheless, it can be useful for social policy, et cetera, to have an understanding of race because that's how we're all perceived. But to answer your question, my father's from India and my mother's from the States, Caucasian background. So that's my mixed identity.
Sarah, we're going to talk, I just want to say we are going to talk about how all this stuff influences policy as we move on. But Sarah, I'm going to put the same question to you.
Okay. My mother is Filipino and my father is Serbian, but I was born here.
Okay.
So.
Manel.
I think this question around how do you identify yourself is a really complicated one because I think you change the way you identify yourself differently in different spaces. But for the sake of thinking about racial categories, my mother is Iranian and Muslim, and my father was Indian and Hindu. So I come from a multi-religious as well as a mixed race background.
Okay, I'm going to ask you all another question. I'm going to start with you, and that is about self-identifying. So how do you self-identify, Sarah, or Manel, pardon me?
No, that's okay. Well, really, again, really depends on where I am and thinking about at what stage of my life I'm at. I do research with women of mixed race, and I ask them this exact question. How do you think about the ways in which you identify differently? And it really does change over time. I do identify as mixed race now, but when I was younger, there wasn't even this vocabulary to think about mixed race. This is a really relatively recent phenomenon. And people do change the way they identify differently over time. And in the work that I do, what was really interesting is that the women, when they were younger, didn't think about themselves as mixed. Often they wanted to think about themselves as white, and they moved through the category. And mostly it's in college or university that they begin to think about identifying as mixed. So you definitely see changes over time and through exposure of understanding this new language.
Okay, but I want to know, how do you self-identify? Sitting at this table right now, if I said self-identify yourself.
No, for me, I definitely identify as mixed race. That is a really important political category for me to occupy. And for me, it really takes into consideration all these different aspects of my identity to understand that I'm not just one or the other. I am all these things, and I really do honor and understand the contribution that all these different parts have made for me to think about the ways in which I can contribute to different contributions to social justice and the way I'm affiliated to these racial groups.
How about the rest of you? How do you self-identify? Ravi, how do you do it?
Since you say Ravi, it could be Ravi, right?
It could be Ravi. I'll probably call you a little bit of both.
With an Indian background. Well, in my career, I would say East Indian. I mean, I think that's the way I'm perceived by my clients. I think my dual identity helps my clients because I'm sort of, on the one hand, I understand Indian culture because I've been to India many times with my father and grew up somewhat in the Indian community. But then again, my high school is very white, and and I had a very white upbringing with my mother, especially being the Caucasian, raising us for the most part. So I would say. Professionally, there is that perception, and it's actually beneficial in a way because Indians want to hire other Indians, So, but having said that, in terms of my every other sphere of my life, I would definitely say mixed because I do think that I got the best of both worlds in a lot of ways. So,
You need to explain the difference between Ravi and Ravi.
Well, it's interesting because, I remember it was very important to me when I was dating, if I dated someone with an Indian background, then she would naturally say Ravi, correctly. And if my mother says Ravi, but there are very, very close people in my life. My mother's family who pronounce my name in different ways, Ravi or Ravi. My good friends say Ravi, and my wife currently says Ravi, which is very interesting to me. I've never really corrected her. Throughout our courting stages, and so it changes throughout my day.
I think you just did.
Television. Let me ask you this.
Yeah, I know. I should be careful.
You
about
said
that.
you're married, and I want to
Yes.
ask you a personal question. What
Yes.
background's your wife?
Well, it's not. I dated various backgrounds, but it just so happened that fell in love and decided to marry someone who was Caucasian and very mainstream Canadian, actually.
Interesting. I was reading a statistic yesterday from the Census, and 56% of people like you and I, who are visible minorities but live in Canada of South Asian descent, marry people outside South Asians. And I was quite actually surprised by that number. I thought it was higher than I imagined.
It is the highest rate of intermarriages happening between actually South Asian men and white women right now.
Huh.
Really?
Yeah.
There you go. Why
And
do
yet
you think
I see
that is?
arranged marriages all the time.
Well, that's it, right? So that's why we're kind of thinking about these figures and trying to make sense of it. We've always known that the Japanese have the highest rate of intermarriage, right? So it goes Japanese first and then this new figure, but we were trying to make sense of this
That's
new
very
jump.
interesting.
Make sense of it for me, Manel. What is the reason you study this stuff? What do you think?
I think a lot of it has to do with the way in which we think about it. We used to assume that it was mostly black men who were, in fact, intermarrying with white women. But because there's been social acceptance around the idea of South Asian men dating white women, I think that that's really allowed for this kind of growth in the figures.
Well, there's better be acceptance of South Asian women with Caucasian men, because that's what my husband is. So I hope there's acceptance. There is in my family and amongst my friend and colleague circle. So I hope other people do that
My
well.
sister did too. She married someone who happens to be Caucasian. So.
There you go. Reiner, I want to ask you, let's clear the air about terminology. What is the correct way? I know you said you don't like this certain pedigree, but what do you see as the correct way of referring to people who come from various racial backgrounds?
Oh, there is no. When you say correct way, there's no correct way. When
What's
I
your
start
preferred way?
anything I write, well, when I start anything I write, whether it's a book or an article or a book chapter, the first footnote is always an explanation of the terms I use in a particular piece of writing. So it's kind of a convention that we have to use. Particularly for me as a racial skeptic, I don't want to use black, white, mixed race, but in order to communicate effectively and to get rid of these ideas, I have to. So acceptable terms are mixed race that I've come across with. Mixed race, multiracial, biracial. These are terms that people understand, so we can have debate about them.
Let me ask Sarah you this. I feel uncomfortable using the term, and I don't really know why, mixed race. I don't know why I feel uncomfortable. Do you feel okay with that term?
It's better than mutt or half-breed, because a lot of people do use those terms, and they can be derogatory terms. So at this point, mixed race is a lot better than those terms.
Tell me stories about, you've clearly had personal experience with being called derogatory terms.
Well, I kind of feel like the race piece is, they say race is a social construct, but it does have ramifications. And I remember going to church at a young age, to an Orthodox church with my mother and father and my sister. And my mother is brown, my father is white, and we walked in the church and everyone stared. And I was thinking, is it because they think it's a disgrace that my father married someone out of his own race, or that he has children? But I could feel how uncomfortable I was at age 7. So I was thinking, I thought this could be a form of racism, but I didn't know at that time. But when I look back at it, I thought, wow, they really did not like us being there.
How old are you?
Right now?
Yes.
33.
So some 25 years later, this story still resonates with you. You remember it clearly.
There's many stories like that. Like another time I went to a nightclub and a man said to me, "Oh, you know, what nationality are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm mixed. I'm Filipino Serbian." And he said, "No, really, you know, what are you?" I said, "No, that's what I am." He says, "Well, why are you denying your heritage?" I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "I know you're Indian." And I was so upset that I went to the coat check and I showed him my ID and I said, "Does this last name look Indian to you?" And he still wouldn't stop. So it
Maybe he's just flirting with you.
that's not for me.
Yeah,
It wasn't working well.
It wasn't working.
I'm gathering everyone around the table, and Reiner, that you all have shared experiences and similar stories. And I want to give you a chance, if you want to share some with me and with our audience. Ravi, anyone stick out for
Well,
you?
I remember we went to Florida as a family. My mom has an aunt there, and we walked into a restaurant, the same sort of thing. Everyone just stopped and stared at us. And it makes me think about how my father did a lot of research in South Africa because he was a professor and studied multiculturalism and employment equity for interaction. That was his area of interest. And so it just makes me think about when he went with my mother to South Africa and they'd hold hands and walk by the beach, you know, after apartheid. The people must have looked at them and said, "Well, when did you guys get together exactly?" But yeah, I mean, there were some of those experiences growing up. I remember when we were in England, not so much, interestingly enough, in Hamilton where I grew up, because we grew up in the university community, and you know, a lot of the professors, you know, our friends were professors and parents were professors, and so they were from different places. So it was a bit of a bubble. So not so much in terms of my growing up there, but on a sabbatical of my dad's in England, I remember there were some kids, and they you know, cried out a racial slur, you know, at my brother and I, and then we, you know, yelled back. You know, a swear, you know, we told them where to go, and then they immediately realized that we had North American accents, and said, "Oh, you must be American." They came over and they wanted to hang out with us. And so it was just, you know, I was in Manchester, you know, working class, and that was just, so there were some things like that made me, you know, gave me pause. You know, I think about it, you know, people talk about going to East Germany. I say, well, you know, as someone with my identity, I read in the paper, maybe I'm more sensitive to it than others. There are certain places in the world I probably would, you know, I think twice about going to. I read about the neo-Nazis or skinheads. So there's those kinds of things that I think about. But for the most part, I think I'm pretty mainstream in terms of my day-to-day now.
Jean, forgive me for sounding insensitive if I do when I ask you this question, but unlike the other four of our guests on this show, Reiner can't see you, but to me you look Caucasian. When I look at you, you look Caucasian.
Yeah, well, and that's because there's a large part of me that is. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I mean, that's just the way it is. But I wanted to go back by way of, in a roundabout way, answering your question, to go back to something that Manel said earlier, which is that this is a new phenomena, this mixed race thing. And I just want to completely contradict that and say it's absolutely not new. This country's based on that, and the people that I come out of, the Métis people of the northwest of Canada, are based on that idea. The idea that of basically white fur trade men, French and mostly Scottish, but mostly French, coming and marrying Indian women of various Indian tribes. So the mixture there is huge. We tend to think of Indians across Canada as sort of a pan, as if they're all one. And there are as many varieties of Indians in Canada as there are Europeans. I mean, the Mohawks are as different from the Cree as the Italians are from the Finns, right? So we've got all those different groups here to begin with. So you have mixed tribes or mixed nations already in this country to begin with. You bring French people over here, French men, and there are no white women, period, right? And it's not even choices, right? There's no white women. So you come over here and they're marrying Indian women. And then what happens in the creation of the Métis people is because they're not wanted on either side, right? The children, and originally called half-breeds, right? So, which is, I agree, a very pejorative term, because we don't breed people, right? We breed animals. And you can guess if you're a half-breed, which half is the human half and which half is the animal half, because it's sure not the white side that's going to be the animal that you're breeding here. So you're half-breeds because you're marrying, and our French term for les sauvages, right? You know, you're savages, you're half-breeds, you're every pejorative term you can think of. So, but that's not just white folks thinking, it's also Native American thinking too. They don't like it either. Nobody likes, and Manel has a great term, she calls it relentless negativity, and towards the people in the middle. But what happened is, because the Métis aren't wanted by the Indians and they're not wanted by the Europeans, they had about 200 years to create their own society. So we have a whole new culture that grew up in the middle here, not wanted, not liked, and still to this day, not wanted to be acknowledged as existing from either side.
Manel, I want to ask you, what is relentless negativity?
No, I think Jean's totally dead on. You know, at first I want to address the point, Jean's point around, you know, mixing is nothing new. We like to think that this is a really novel phenomenon, but what we're doing is prioritizing mixing between new immigrant groups and thinking that there hasn't been mixing going on for generations and generations. So I think that's really key, because we talk about mixed race, but we don't talk about the issues around anti-colonialism and thinking about how colonialism has played a huge role in the way that we've seen mixing all over the world. Because of course, mixing means different things in different places. What's happening in Korea around the mixing between Korean bachelors in rural areas is really interesting, because these Korean men in these rural areas can't find wives because the women are going to work in the urban areas. And so they're actually importing brides from Pakistan and the Philippines. And so this new breed is called Caucasians breed. You know, Caucasians, Koreans and Asians. And they're really stigmatized, and that goes back to this relentless negativity around the personification of mixed race people, and thinking about how it is that we've moved from this pervasive psychopathology, oh no, what about the kids, they must be torn and confused about their identity. Well, I don't think any of us wake up in the middle of the night going, oh, I'm so confused about who I am. We all know who we are. It's other people who have problems in terms of classifying us. They need to know who we are. They want to put us in a racial box.
Reiner, I want to ask you, you know, mixed unions and the offspring of them have been happening for decades and centuries and so on and so forth. But has the conversation changed? And if so, why?
The conversation hasn't changed. The conversation amongst, there are different conversations. The conversation amongst scholars has changed and evolved. The conversation amongst regular folks and amongst the media is very, very static. There were a slew of articles in the mid-1990s in the United States, put up by Time and Newsweek magazines primarily. This was when the U.S. was trying to decide whether or not to change its system of categorization to include a multiracial category or to allow people to check as many as apply, which is what was eventually decided. And these Time and Newsweek articles were incredibly mawkish and actually quite insulting to the idea of mixed race identity, because it tended to infantilize people, the sorts of things that Manel was just talking about. So there's this new series that the New York Times has been doing since January called Race Remixed. And when I read Race Remixed, I swear I could be reading Time or Newsweek from 15 or 17 years ago. It's absolutely the same. There's no change really, I think, in the national conversation in the United States. There's really been no change except to suggest that this is new, this is faddish, it's going to end race tomorrow, if not tomorrow, then the next day, which I think is really, really unfortunate.
When we think of race, Reiner, in the U.S., I think most people, it turns into a black and white issues. The conversation's still about that, or have we at least moved forward in that conversation?
It has, but there's some interesting dynamics in that. In the United States, mixed race advocacy organizations are just about always headed by suburban white women who are the mothers of black, white, mixed race children. Regardless, and this is interesting because in the United States, the smallest and slowest growing mixed faction is the black-white faction. But when, generally speaking, in the United States, it'll be acknowledged that there are sort of newer and different mixes coming along, but the narrative is always put in terms of the black-white narrative, and it's very, very, I won't say it's confusing, it's erroneous.
Ravi, go ahead.
Well, I have to jump in, just because, you know, I am actually a U.S. and Canadian citizen. I was born and raised in Canada. I did do a master's degree in the States, so I spent some time there, but I also visited the States constantly throughout my life because my mom's family is all there in different states. So, but what's interesting to me is I think there might be, you know, in studying the United States also, you know, academically, and race issues, because I did a philosophy degree, and then I studied law in the States and in Canada, and looked at our different programs that we have. What strikes me about the United States and the United States experience is that it is a very segregated society. I mean, more so than in Canada, I think. And I think that the whole black-white thing is very, you know, very pronounced. And you look at Obama, who kind of felt like he had to, choose the black identity in a way to sort of, create, to self-identify and just in terms of his own growing up. And I just think there may be a different sort of experience in Canada. Like we went to, I remember I made friends at a Jain camp. Jainism is a religion, my father's religion. And there was a Jain camp, and I went to the white camps. I went to the YMCA camps also in the summer. But I went to a Jain camp, and it was a wonderful experience because, as I said, I grew up with mostly white friends. And there it was, I really didn't, not that I felt it so strongly, the color of my skin, but there it was just not an issue because everyone was the same skin color, and we all formed wonderful friendships. And then they would talk to me, the friends from the States who were at this Jain camp, they would come to Canada, and they say, there's something different here. Like, I just don't feel the color of my skin as much as in the United States. And then I'd go to the States, and I would feel it a little more. I would just feel the fact that race was more of an issue in the States than I did feel in Canada. And I see, Sarah's nodding and others. So I think, I just want to clarify, that I think that there may be a different sort of experience going on. I don't think the States is quite at where we are. And again, it could relate to policy and multiculturalism and other things, but they are more segregated.
But let me throw this out there. I'm from Saskatchewan originally, and oftentimes people say to me things like, whoa, must have been hard growing up brown in Saskatchewan, right? I mean, the States is a diverse place. Are we talking about, in your opinion, the States being this monolith that race and mixed unions and all this is treated the same everywhere? Are we talking about urban America versus rural America?
I just think the States generally, and I think, again, it's because of national policy, and I think it's, again, because of the way in which the media and the way in which mainstream society, I just don't think the States is as enlightened, frankly, on race issues. I really believe that and it's because of our history and with Trudeau and multicultural, and Trudeau, the whole multicultural, that wasn't just benign sort of, enlightened thinking necessarily. It was about accommodating the Ukrainians, right, and the large ethnic groups, and so it just sort of, I think, happened a bit by accident. But I do think there's a different thing going on in Canada where we don't feel it as much, and I can't articulate exactly why, but I'm just saying I just don't feel it as much in Canada as in the States.
We're going to talk about multiculturalism. Before we get to that further on in the conversation, Reiner, I want to get you to respond to what Ravi's saying there.
Good, because I was wanting to.
Go ahead.
First of all, I'm not the person who's out to defend the United States, at all. I think we have some serious problems, politically, in all sorts of ways, particularly for our military aggressions. However, I think that the differences probably they're historical differences. The U.S. has a very, very strong, the history of slavery in the United States is strong and still defines race relations in the United States. Now, Canadians don't have that particular experience. Manel's talking about colonialism. We don't really have a sort of colonial experience in the United States. Really, our history is a history of slavery and of aggression against Native Americans. So there are different dynamics. However, I think that just as in the case of Brazil and the sort of fallacy about the Brazilian racial paradise that was prevalent 50 years ago, I at least am not willing to say that Canadians are more enlightened in regard to race. I just think there's a different dynamic. I'm willing to bet that in both places, it's much better to be a white male than to be a black female. So just because the black-white issue may not be as pronounced, or just because people may be talking about multiculturalism more in Canada than in the United States, doesn't mean that there isn't a racial hierarchy and that race isn't a major problem.
I think everyone's going to want to weigh in on this one. I'm going to go to Manel and then to you, Sarah. Manel, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Rainer's dead on. I think one of the biggest differences in terms of looking at the similarities and the divergent points is the reality of slavery and colonialism. I couldn't agree more with that. But I really want to bring an analogy that came out of the interviews that I did with women of mixed race, because one of them said fighting racism in the States is like punching a brick wall, but fighting it in Canada is like punching a marshmallow, always melts back to the same shape. And I think that's a really instructive kind of way of understanding multiraciality in the Canadian context, right? To think about how we like to live within the state of kind of denial that we live in a racist country. We did have slavery here. It just took on less obvious forms. And yet we also have this idea we really want to believe that we're an accommodating, open nation. So a lot of these women who I interviewed felt really pulled between these two perspectives. And I think we really need to take that into account when you look at the way in which women thought about the multicultural policy, because it's not as if they're reflecting on the policy and saying the policy has opened up spaces for them to experience less racism. They're still experiencing racism. What they want to see is a multicultural policy with teeth that actually makes some changes to understand the complex forms of racism that they experience in their day-to-day lives.
What would that look like? What do you mean by teeth?
Well, actually something that deals with racism within systemic racism, within organizations, right? So they don't want just people to say, well, I'm really open to thinking about these things and having this kind of idea that mixed race people are like the solution to all the world's racist problems, that we're all sitting around and singing Kumbaya and eating our saris, having our samosas and wearing our saris or whatever, right? They want to actually see changes within institutions, because the reality is there are still institutional barriers for people of color in mainstream institutions, and that's the kind of changes that they'd like to see.
I wanted to talk to some of this too, because part of the thing that I think we ignore is that we're talking about the United States and Canada as if there's no blend between the two of them. And I don't think that's right. I think that it's true that if you want to look at the original sin, sorry I was raised as a Catholic, of the Americans, it is slavery. Our original sin in Canada is the way we treated our Aboriginal people, and we are going to play that one out for generations. But the truth is that there is a very porous border across here, and there are influences back and forth. So just let me tell you a story about my mother, who is white, as I said, Scottish and Polish background. When she used to sing in something called Sweet Adelines. It's a choral group, and they had barbershop quartets. And we grew up in, I would call it Red River, but in Winnipeg, Manitoba, right? Very French, very white back in my old day, right? And this black woman from the United States came and auditioned for the Sweet Adelines choir, which was an entirely white choir. And my mother was on the board, and my mom said she was just a drop-dead amazing singer. So her vote was, oh, well, let's bring her in right away. And everybody else on the board said no, because she was black. And my mother said, well, why not let her in? And they said, well, because our rules say that, you can't do that. And my mother said, well, let's change the rules. And they said, no, we can't do that. And my mother said, why? And they said, because we compete in the United States. And if we go to the United States and we compete in the United States and we bring a black woman in there, we won't be allowed in. And my mother said, well, then we should separate from them. But they wouldn't take that. She ended up quitting in protest. It was a big story back in the early 60s, right? But all I'm illustrating there is the fact that the influences from the United States and slavery in the United States cannot be entirely separated from what happens in Canada. And I also think that our multiracialism or our multiculturalism policy and the way we deal with Indians or Native Americans here, because we didn't play cowboys and Indians like they did in the States, which was a death sentence. We played a different game with smallpox blankets and everything. We're just quieter and we're stealth fighters in our way of killing Indians. But I think they both influenced each other, and I don't think we can separate them.
Sarah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say about the part about representation. I think it's really important, kind of what Manal was saying, the systemic barriers. People say, why don't people buy into multiculturalism or diversity at work? Well, it's kind of like saying, how do you break the ceiling? Because the ceiling is still there. How do you break past that? So I think people will start buying in. I don't like the term buying in, but when they see people of color or becoming more of a majority in higher positions. And as for the census piece, I think that's a big part of categorizing people. When people are forced to categorize themselves, for example, in the States, people have to choose, black, white, or whatever, and only until year 2000 did they say you can now pick, I don't know if it was mixed race or other, and you can imagine how people were forced to choose. They didn't have a choice. So I think that has, like for example, Obama saying he's black, that could have been throughout his life, he was forced to say I'm black. So I can see why he might not say he's mixed race even though he is.
Okay, we're going to talk about Obama and categorization and census coming up, but there's a question that keeps coming back in my head as we're having this conversation, and it's this. I'm a child of Indian parents. Clearly the color of my skin is not white. We're all having an open and frank discussion. Would it make a difference? Would you all feel less comfortable if I was a white man or three people sitting at this table were Caucasians? Or is this a conversation, I always wonder, is this a conversation we're only allowed to have amongst ourselves? Or is it okay for that white person not only to ask questions out of curiosity, but to weigh in with their opinions? Manal, I want to ask you that.
Oh, well, no, of course. I mean, the whole point is to open up a dialogue
But
about
white
these
people
issues.
don't feel comfortable doing it a lot of
I'm
them.
not sure if that's the case, though. I think a lot of people do feel comfortable. I mean, I think that for all of us in the room, we really feel okay and comfortable, with having the conversation. And it's not as if people ask me where I'm from and it's a white person, and if it comes from a place of genuine kind of curiosity, I'm totally happy to do that. It's only when people are saying, I need to know what your racial background is. What is your blood quantum? Are you 80% Indian or 15% Iranian? That's when I get a bit irate. But I think that we can have these conversations, and that's really the whole point of opening up this category of multiraciality.
You get to be the arbiter of why they're asking the question, though.
No, that's completely not the case at all. I mean, I've been in situations where I've been asked about my racial background, and it's been dangerous. I mean, I had a knife pulled on me in Halifax one time. Somebody was like demanding to know, where are you from? And I mean, for me, that's certainly not a place in which I have any power whatsoever. The power was completely out of my hands. So no, I think it's a little bit more complex than that.
Reiner, let me ask you that question. This very, politically correct world where everyone's a bit sensitive talking about touchy or awkward subjects, is this a conversation that we just need to be more open to having?
Yes. It's interesting that in the United States, every now and then there'll be this a sort of great emergency. The last one was the Henry Louis Gates and the policeman in Harvard, and Obama weighing in. Are you aware of that incident where Henry Louis Gates was arrested in his own home, etc.? And whenever these things happen, for the next 2 days, we are told by the talking heads and the politicians and the cultural moguls that, well, at least now we're going to have a conversation on race, a national conversation on race. And guess what? It never happens.
Why not?
We tell ourselves, because people don't actually want to talk about it. So I think the suggestion the question you pose, should white people or anybody feel comfortable talking about it, and should we have this conversation? The answer is yes, of course. The problem is, oftentimes we don't have it.
What do you think?
And that's the real tragedy.
But then I remember when Obama was running for office, I remember he had to deal with this, as the pastor, the religious person in his life, the issue about, and he had this beautiful piece where he really did talk about race, and maybe he's just too busy right now to deal with it. But I think that the way he handled it was quite interesting, and I think only he would have that authority, being biracial, to sort of have them over for a beer at the White House and try to resolve it. But I think, your question was about, white people, talking about this with white people. And I've had many conversations with friends, growing up and over the years. And what I've noticed is what I called to myself internally the sandbox approach to race issues. And that is, we're taught, when we're in the sandbox, that race doesn't matter. So I think for white people, to then be told later, well, race should matter in this situation because there are these systems of related barriers. There is this oppression, and there are these experiences you have. The beer commercials growing up where there weren't any visible minorities in the beer commercials. What was an attractive woman on, growing up as a teenager? Well, she was blonde or brunette, but she was white. Now it's different. Now you get the guys saying to me, oh, I have Asian fever, or I have this, or I have that. And there's other kinds of lots of different types of women are. So the point is but to talk about these systems of related barriers, it's very complicated. It's something that a white person would have to have a lot of moral imagination to be able to figure out. And so they don't get it if you try to say, well, look, I think that we should have a census. I think we should track these things. I think the fact that the boardrooms of Canada don't look like they should, or the courts, or in law, and issues in law, it's all over, right? And so people say, wait a minute, you want to discriminate against white people, don't you? You want to hire that person who's unqualified. That's what you want to do. And even understanding the difference between employment equity and affirmative action, which is more employment equity is more about goals and time. My father, sort of pioneered this area in his area of research, and he got the Order of Canada for it. So he's really, I've watched his whole life, going to South Africa and showing them how to integrate blacks into the workforce. So this issue's been with me forever, and I just think that there's, that it's very difficult for people to understand that it's not racist per se if you try to move things forward in a way that is not natural.
Sarah, let me ask you this, because like Ravi, you have Caucasian relatives. Are they comfortable talking about these kinds of issues with you?
I don't have any relatives that are in Canada, in Toronto, but I think a lot of your identity is just how you look and how people perceive you. So when I'm with, and I think it's cultural too. So for example, with Filipinos, I'm light-skinned, And when I go to the Philippines, they have a term called mestiza. Mestiza is mixed, and it has a connotation of beautiful and pretty. So when I go there, I can use my skin color to my advantage. So sometimes when you're mixed race, you can be fluid amongst your race, and you can be privileged. When I'm amongst Serbians, I feel I don't speak the language, and sometimes I don't look the part. And I've had circumstances that haven't been as pleasant, but it could be because I don't have the relatives here. And I think growing up, your family or your mother can shape a lot of who you are, of your identity. So,
I want to move ahead. We've mentioned Obama, and we're going to talk more about him. But a decade or so before Obama, there was a guy named Tiger Woods who hopped into the spotlight. And I want to read a quote. Take a listen to this. This was written back in 1997 when Tiger Woods, shortly after he won the Masters tournament. Here's what it said. After Tiger Woods won the Masters tournament, the media went into a veritable orgy of racial sentimentality. While blacks celebrated the triumph of one of their own in a lily-white sport, whites wiped away tears and congratulated themselves on their remarkable progress. The choreographed racial minuet was proceeding as smoothly as a 30-second Nike spot. And then Tiger Woods said he wasn't black at all. He was Cablinasian. Woods made his remarks on Oprah when he was asked if it bothered him to be called African American. He said, "It does. Growing up, I came up with this name. I'm a Cablinasian, as in Caucasian, Black, Indian, Asian." Woods has a black father, or to be precise, the writer writes, if I'm interpreting Woods' reported ancestry correctly, a half-black, one-quarter American Indian, one-quarter white father, and a Thai mother, or with the same caveat, a half-Thai, half-Chinese mother. "I'm just who I am," Woods told Oprah Winfrey, "whoever you see in front of you." Reiner, how has Tiger Woods influenced the discussion of multiracial identity in the United States? We're 15 years on since that quote came out.
And not much I don't think a whole lot has changed since then. What he did, and also I'd like to point out, when I was talking before about Time and Newsweek and the New York Times today, that article that you are, I hope, sarcastically citing is exactly the type of sentiment that I'm talking about that doesn't get us anywhere. What Tiger Woods did, there's a scholar, Carrie Ann Rockmore, who wrote a book chapter about Tiger Woods, and I want to use her. I want to give her credit in using her point here. There's actually only one Cablinasian in the world, and that's Tiger Woods. Because of his status, because of who he is, you or I can declare ourselves Cablinasians, but guess what? We're not going to get away with it. He's the only person who can get away with saying that. So it's very, what happens, I think, is that whites in general in the United States look at someone like Tiger Woods, and this is indicative of what the mixed race movement does. They look at that and say, "Oh, great, whew, racism must be over." Just like all of the misplaced hoopla when Obama won his election several years ago. It doesn't change very much of anything when this or that particularly exceptional black person, black male usually, receives some particular high honor or is allowed into some particular club. So we need to be cautious in not letting down our guard just because this or that exceptional black person has been allowed into a particular club.
Okay, I see a lot of heads nodding around the table here, so let me get everyone to weigh in. Sarah, what do you think?
I think at that time, the whole term, why people were upset, black people, was because he used Cablinasian, but Caucasian first. And they said, why does he have to identify as being white first? That was a huge uproar amongst the black community because being black, it has a huge political identity. So by saying you're Caucasian first, it was like a loss to them. It's like Obama being forced to say that he is, black when he's mixed race. So it kind of parallels how time isn't really changing as much.
Jean.
I just think there's a racial purity concept that goes along in this that I find deeply troubling. I'm not even sure what race means in a lot of ways because, technically, aren't East Indians Caucasians? Technically?
Way back,
I think that's when they talk about racial breakdowns, that's what they talk about. The Caucasians and East Indians fit into that category, which has always been a little strange.
Aryan or something?
Yeah, well, it sort of makes me sort of go, oh, then what does it mean? What is it? So I have those questions in the first place, but I think this racial purity thing that goes on, which is what Tiger Woods is trying to combat, right? But I think that's what Sarah's talking about too is that the black community is fighting for a racial purity kind of concept, and the white community is also fighting for a racial purity concept, except that the white community wants to look nice. You know, they want to wear their white hat, right? You know, I mean, to use the black-white metaphor again, but they want to be seen as the nice guys. They don't want to be seen as the colonial, racist bigots that they might really be. You know?
Manel.
And that goes back to a lot what Rainer was speaking about earlier, right? This idea that in the States, the multiracial movements were in fact led by white women who were really experiencing a lot of racial anxieties over the birth about their mixed race kids. And they didn't want not to be recognized, you know, the whiteness of their children to be recognized. Like that's been a really important part of thinking about this white-black kind of binary that's so structured, the multiracial debate in the US. But then what do you do with people like me and Sarah, right? Who come from these racialized minority backgrounds? I mean, we're not white and black, we're really outside of that paradigm. So it really behooves us to think about how to complicate these categories and to think about mixing as mixing between different racialized groups. It's not just a black-white debate anymore.
Robbie, earlier in the show, you talked about, you know, when you were younger, trying to find role models, people that looked like you or represented you in some ways. And I'm wondering, you were a young, I don't know how old you were in 1997, but you were a younger guy. Tiger Woods comes onto the scene.
Not so much. No, the first time it really happened was really with Obama. And that's why I was slightly disappointed that he didn't really embrace his mixed racial identity more than he did. I mean,
Did he not, or did people not let him?
You know, that's complicated. I think it's because he was in the States, you know. Ryan will forgive me, but I mean, I do think that there was probably more pressure there and I think in trying to figure out who he was. I mean, I read his books, and I think that, you know, he said that he really felt more comfortable. He dated outside the black and race, and then he, you know, that was just what happened to him. But what was disappointing to me was that he didn't really, you know, fully embrace his mother's half. I mean, like, to me, it's like erasing half of who you are. Like, it's in a way, it's insulting to your parent, who is the other race that you're saying you're not. You know, so that was the very first time. I mean, here's someone who's obviously thought about, you know, his mixed identity in his writings, and he wants to make a difference in the world, and he was the first person that I really felt, wow, I feel, not that I have a lot in common, I feel like I had something in common with the most powerful man in the world, but maybe but I just felt that, wow, this guy really understands race in a deep way, and it's so great that he is the president of the United States, and why I just wish he would have embraced a little bit of the other half.
Reiner, I want you to pick up from that, because I guess I'm going to be a bit of an apologist for Obama, but people really didn't allow him to be who he wanted to be in terms of self-identify. I mean, for goodness sakes, they wouldn't even accept what religion he's from. So, I mean, pardon me, so is Obama, I mean, is it his fault, or how much does he have to own this discussion?
Well, I think the religion issue is part of a racism issue. You know, he went to a black church, however controversial that may have been, that particular church. He went to a black church. You didn't find black people in the United States questioning his religion. So I really think that just like the ridiculous birther issue, that the religious issue is a racist issue. It's a tool that's used against. It's a way, as the lady was saying just a moment ago, Jean. It's a way of being racist without looking like you're being racist. However, to the question of his choice on the census, I find it fascinating as I sit here in Las Vegas, listening to everyone so assured that Obama was forced to choose black on the census. You know, one of the things about the mixed race movement is not that anyone on the show is a member of the mixed race movement. I don't actually know, but how often it will say people should be free to identify as they are, and yet you find people saying that, well, Obama let us down, or Obama was forced to choose black. I mean, let's give him credit for if he feels like blackness, in whatever way he's conceptualizing it, whether it's cultural, whether it's political, whether it's even biological, I don't know. But let's give him credit for the answer that he gave and not question him. You know, people who are mixed race will often say, well, people are questioning my mixed race identity. You know, why don't I just, you know, say I'm black, or when I just say I'm Filipino? But we're willing to do to Obama what we don't want people to do to us. And I think it's really fascinating to look at.
Okay, I'm going to move on because we only have about 10 minutes left, and we've all mentioned the word categorization, and I want to talk about that. I want to bring up one last thing. This also comes from the Canadian Census, and this is about a question from this year's census, Canadian Census, about how you self-identify. And here's what it says. Mark more than one or specify if applicable. Here are your choices. White, South Asian, and then in parentheses it has, are you East Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lankan? Chinese, Black, Filipino, Latin American, Arab, Southeast Asian, again in parentheses, a number of options, West Asian, Korean, Japanese, and the last option is other, hyphen, specify with a line. Ravi, let me start with you. What do you make of these categories?
Well, I do think that they're, like I said, I think it's important to document and so that we have information. So I was very disappointed that, the census was killed in terms of the mandatory nature of it. And having all that information, I know, is very important so that we can address inequality in society and address systemic discrimination, et cetera. So I do think that it's important to get the information out there so we can do something about the inequity in our lives. But, in terms of how, it's tricky. I mean, I would always tick off other because, yes, professionally it's South Asian, but I mean, I do feel that it's, I really want to recognize both parts. So, and to Reiner's point, like it's not that I would judge Obama necessarily, but I guess what I'm saying is, it is exciting to me when I meet other people who are mixed race because it's so rare, and less so in Toronto. And I remember saying to my sister and brother, we should form this movement, mixed people of the world unite, and just to sort of gather around a bit more and just to meet people who are like us and have the same sort of experiences we do. So not without I'm not judging him, but I'm just saying I was just a little bit hoping that he would embrace it more. But anyway.
Jean, I want to ask you this. What are you going to check off on this list?
Don't you think it's bizarre that most of them are cultural identities or geographic identities, but white is color only? And I mean, what does that mean? I mean, if you're white, I mean, theoretically it should be European or African or something to be consistent with this, but you've got one color identification in there. And there's nothing in there that says black, right? There's nothing in there that says red or yellow or anything like that. It's only, it's the most strange collection. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall while they were having their discussions, deciding how they were going to put that together. And what are you going to make of it anyway? The answers.
It does say black, but it doesn't.
Sorry, it does say
no,
black.
but it doesn't say red or brown or the other things. I mean, where do you fit into this list? Because I'm really going over it and I'm looking at you and remembering what you said about your background. Yeah, you're going to check other.
I check everything. I just go all of it because I'm sort of I'm not interested in saying, oh, I'm not this or I'm only that. I take it that the point of the census is to get accurate information. So I'll give you all the things that I am, but the question of, I'm not sure. So what is the actual question? Is it how do you identify?
How do you self-identify?
Self-identify. Yeah. See, but at any given time, I can self-identify as a dozen different things. I mean, I'm a woman. I could identify by my language group, I could identify by my religion, I can identify by my family, by where I live today, by where I lived when I was a kid, by what color I am, by what color I am in the summer, and if I'm hanging out with my Métis, and I do a lot of work with Aboriginal people, they tend to just look at me as Métis. And Riel, right? So that's a huge, huge identity factor. But if I walk the streets of downtown Toronto, that's not an identity factor for me. So I think it's a bizarre question. I mean, I'd almost write them to say, how do you identify in the morning? How do you identify in the afternoon? How do you identify when you're in church? And how do you identify when you're with your grandparents? I mean, or how do you identify when you go visit Greece? All of those things. See, that's just meaningless.
We have less than 5 minutes left, and I want to leave a little bit of time. And Manel, I want to go to you on this. What are the social policy implications for things that come out of these kinds of questions on census? And Reiner, I'll come to you after this, but let me start with Manel.
Yeah, no, I think I really take Jean's point, because there's this one thing that came up in a lot of my research is the problematic nature of this question. And why do we have these questions? It's really to think about the kind of social planning that we need to do in order to develop our worlds in some way. And if you have a question like this, where people don't even know how to begin to answer the question because they're unhappy with the question, what kind of answers are you going to give? And one thing that happens with a question like that for women of mixed race, at least in the research that I've done, is they just get so flummoxed and angry with the question that they check off everything. So how is that going to help policymakers in regards to making change? And again, like Jean says, people change the way they identify over time. Like, a lot of people will identify as other, but then what do you do with that other category? It really doesn't help you in terms of thinking through resources and the allocation of resources. So my point is really thinking about this relationship between identity and loyalty. You can have loyalty to many different groups, even if you do have a multiple identity, but it's how that's negotiated. Because a lot of the women I talked to said, I identify as mixed, but when it comes down to that census, I check black, because I know what that means and I know the difference that can make.
Reiner, in the U.S., in your census, you can also check off more than one category. What is it? What are the implications of checking off boxes for social policy?
Well, I don't know how these categories developed in Canada, but I can tell you that my first book, I looked at how they developed in the United States. And although they look very disparate and not matching, and some are geographical and some are race-based, the original categories in the United States were black, white, Asian, Native American, and Hispanic, either as an ethnic category or as a race. And the reason was, we're trying to, because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the necessity of anyone who receives money from the federal government being able to prove that they're not in violation of these acts, we had to have compliance. How do you show compliance? You show compliance through statistics. And so these categories are actually the black, American Indian, Asian, Hispanic. These are categories of groups. These are people who were discriminated against by the United States government. And then the leftover category is white. So although they are confusing and there's a big disconnect between the categories and the public, it really does great damage to tracking civil rights violations when people check all the categories. Ideally, really the best way to handle it is for you to check off, maybe not so much the census, but on the other forms. I guess in Canada you have all these other forms also. Loan applications, federal aid for financial aid and schooling. It's really the best thing to do is to check off the way you are perceived, because it's not an identity contest. It's a contest to determine who's getting resources, who's being discriminated against. Racists don't care what you are. If they see something they don't like, that's what they're reacting to. The racist doesn't care if you're when I get discriminated against, I'm discriminated against because someone sees me as black. They don't discriminate against me because they see me as half white. That's the point I'd make.
Folks, we're going to have to leave it there, but I want to say this before we go. You know, we had a guest on, a gentleman named John L. Jackson, after Obama's victory, to talk about race and the discussion of race in North America. And he said it was time to develop a new conceptual framework, to have an open and honest discussion that does more than pay lip service. And I hope at least today we took this discussion a little bit further. Thank you to all of you for joining me tonight. In Las Vegas, Nevada, Reiner Spencer from the University of Nevada.
Thank you for an awesome experience.
Thank you. And here in studio, Manel Matani, who's a professor of geography and journalism at the University of Toronto. And on my other side, Sarah Grzinsic, who is completing a master's degree at the U of T. Ravi Jain, who is a lawyer with the Toronto firm Green and Spiegel. And Jean Taye, who is the great-grandniece of Louis Riel and also a partner in the law firm Pape, Salter, and Taye. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.